From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm Kevin Merida. I'm the national editor of the Washington Post. We're proud sponsors of the National Book Festival for many, many years. So on behalf of the Library of Congress, I'd like to welcome you to the 2012 National Book Festival. I hope everybody's having a wonderful day being with these wonderful authors, and I know there are nothing but book lovers here. Before we begin, I want to let you know that the pavilion's presentations are being filmed for the Library of Congress's website and for their archives and by C-SPAN for airing on Book TV, so please be mindful of this as you enjoy the presentation. In addition, please do not sit on the camera risers that are located in the back of the pavilion, and please silence your cell phones and beepers. Thank you very much. I have the pleasure today of introducing Elizabeth Dowling Taylor. And she has written this wonderful book and very important book, A Slave in the White House, Paul Jennings and the Madisons. You know, as a journalist, I'm really interested in invisible lives. I think that, you know, we certainly have a lot of invisible lives among us, people who often don't get written about, or they're seen in our society, but they are not really seen and made alive. And to go back into the slave history, particularly slaves who worked on presidential plantations, is really kind of unearthing invisible life. Elizabeth is the former director of interpretation at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello and also director of education at James Madison's Montpelier, and she is now a fellow at the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities. Her book, A Slave in the White House, Paul Jennings and the Madisons, which was released by Palgrave Macmillan in January 2012, was a New York Times bestseller and a National Book Award nominee. Kirkus, in a review, called it an important story of human struggle, determination, and triumph. Paul Jennings was someone who was born into slavery on the James and Dolly Madison plantation and became part of the White House household staff. He was later emancipated by Senator Daniel Webster and would write the first White House memoir, and even gave an aged and broke Dolly Madison money out of his own pocket later in life. He died a free man in Northwest Washington at age 75. And Elizabeth brings his story to life, including, you know, some very unflattering things about President Madison and Dolly Madison and the period in time, but a lot about the life of Paul Jennings. And so without further ado, please welcome Elizabeth Dowling Taylor.
Good afternoon. I am a first-time author, and I am thrilled to be here. This was a true labor of love. I researched my topic for 3 years and spent a year plus writing it. And it is humbling and gratifying to see it be so well received and to be following Walter Isaacson, Robert Caro, and Tony Horowitz. I came to develop a strong interest in Paul Jennings when I was Director of Education at James Madison's Montpelier in Virginia. I was familiar with Jennings' memoir considered by the White House Historical Association to be the first memoir of life in the White House. It was titled A Colored Man's Reminiscences of James Madison. And as the title implies, it's really more about the so-called great man than it was about the author himself. But my interest was in Paul Jennings, and I set out to discover elements of his own biography, to uncover the circumstances behind the original publication of the memoir in 1865, and to find and interview living direct descendants. A Slave in the White House, Paul Jennings and the Madisons, is the story of Paul Jennings' unique journey from slavery to freedom. It played out in the highest circles of ideas and power: the White House, James Madison's study. It's the story of Paul Jennings' complicated relationship with the father of the Constitution, James Madison. Jennings was the constant servant in James Madison's study. And as Madison would discuss the political subjects of the day, and during his retirement, review his life's work defining and defending natural rights and self-government, Paul was there to hear it all. And in the book, I developed the thesis that he was able to absorb the theoretical underpinnings that would allow him to identify his innate yearning for freedom as a natural right of man. Jennings and Madison developed a close bond of mutual respect, but they never were able to altogether bridge that very deep divide between white elite and black slave. Nevertheless, Jennings had reason to expect that he would be freed by the terms of James Madison's will. When this did not happen, he was given to understand that Madison and his wife Dolly had come to an understanding before he died that she would free all the 100 Montpelier slaves at her death. And indeed, when she wrote a will of her own a few years after that, she had a term giving freedom to my mulatto man, Paul, the only slave so treated. She and her son by her first marriage, Payne Todd, who plays the role of foil to Jennings in the book. Payne Todd had every advantage in life and squandered them. Jennings had no advantages, but managed to carve out a life of meaning, nevertheless. So Dolly and her son Payne were selling slaves a mere 2 months after her husband died. Now, in 1838, Dolly Madison moved back to Washington. She owned a house on Lafayette Square, just a block away from the White House. Well, Paul Jennings was an integral member of her household staff. So, like it or not, he went back to Washington too. He had come of age in Washington, serving on the Madison domestic staff from age 10 to age 18. And he had considered running away when that period of time was up, but instead, in the end, had gone back to Montpelier. After all, it was his home too. He wasn't ready to never see his mother and other kin and connections again. And he was the only eyewitness who left an account at the death of James Madison. But now, Dolly Madison was selling Montpelier, and that separated Jennings from his own wife and children. He had married an enslaved woman at a nearby plantation to Montpelier, and that meant that their 5 children, as they came along, were owned by his wife's owner. They had barely been able to get together but once a week. And now, Jennings was moving from Virginia altogether. And his wife dies about the same time. So now these are motherless children back in Virginia, the youngest only 2 years old. Now Dolly is hurting financially even after selling Montpelier. She hires Jennings out to work in the James Polk White House. So he has a second experience working in the White House. And at one point, the president and Dolly gave him permission to go back to Virginia to visit his family, but he stayed longer than Dolly approved, and now he was on her bad side. And he determined that he could wait no longer for his autonomy, for his freedom. And that's when he went to Senator Daniel Webster from Massachusetts. Even if a slave, it helps to know people in high places. And Jennings knew that Webster had come to the aid of other slaves in need, but he said he could never own a slave, so his MO was to extend the purchase price and then have the newly free individual work for Webster in his household to pay off the purchase price. And that's the deal that he struck with Jennings. Dolly sold Jennings for $200. And Webster allowed Jennings to pay back the purchase price at the rate of $8 a month. But he freed him immediately. So finally, at age 48, Paul Jennings is a free man. And his story after his freedom is as compelling as the one before that event. He became a leading member of the Washington Free Black community. And in 1848, he was an operative in an Underground Railroad activity that turned out to be the largest scale ever attempted slave escape, known to historians as the Pearl Episode. 77 enslaved men, women, and children of Washington, including a runaway teenage slave of Dolly Madison's named Ellen Stewart, boarded a schooner and hid themselves in the hull, hoping to make it to freedom in the North. But it was not to be. Their plan was foiled by contrary winds and by a turncoat in the black community. The schooner left the harbor, but immediately there were but light winds on the Potomac. That really slowed the vessel down. But then when it finally got to the Chesapeake, the winds were too rough to enter the bay. They had to hunker down. With the informant, that meant that the white owners back in Washington became aware sooner instead of later, this was a Sunday now, that their slaves had masterminded, working with white northern abolitionists as well as local black operatives like Paul Jennings, an escape. And they were after them, found them, and pulled the schooner back to Washington along with its human cargo. And those on board now faced the fate they most dreaded, which was sail to the Deep South and permanent separation from home and family. Paul Jennings' role was never known to the authorities because it was a good plan with information dispensed on a need-to-know basis, and only the white sea captain named Daniel Drayton could have given up the other names to the authorities, and he declined to do so and spent over 4 years in jail. What really impresses me about this story is that this was 1848, Paul Jennings' first full year of freedom. So he risked his hard-won status to try to help others reach freedom themselves. And along that same year or so, he also sat for his daguerreotype. This is the only known likeness of Paul Jennings or of any Montpelier slave. And I first set eyes on it at the home of Paul Jennings' great-granddaughter, Sylvia Jennings Alexander. She was the family historian, the keeper of the Jennings family oral traditions, and several of the Jennings direct descendants are in the audience today. Not Mrs. Alexander, however. She died a year and a half after I got to know her. She was by far the last survivor of that near generation. Her father, her grandfather, Paul's son, Franklin, lived to be 90, and she spent a lot of her growing up years in her grandparents' home. So she was able to hear these family stories nearly from the horse's mouth. Well, her own father was a slave. Her own grandfather was a slave until age 20 himself. This is very rare in 2008 when I met her, and where she had this likeness of Paul Jennings on her living room wall. Very rare to be able to debrief a slave descendant whose family stories truly do go right back to slavery days. So getting to know all of the descendants, but especially Sylvia Jennings Alexander, very much informed my story and enriched my life. Now, I interpret Paul Jennings' story as a deliberate, a courageous, and a successful pursuit of that most American of promises, the right to rise. After Jennings had worked for Webster for several years, he got himself a low-level but steady job working for a government agency, the Pension Office, which was under the Department of the Interior. And this was pretty much the best job that a free black at this time, we're talking about the early 1850s when he first got this position, that they might hope to find, really coveted positions. Jennings reunited with his children, and they all lived together in Northwest Washington in a neighborhood that included ex-slaves not only of President Madison, but also of Presidents Washington and Jefferson. So it was a vibrant antebellum community, mixed-race community in Northwest Washington. And Jennings also married a second wife. So he had a new job, he was a new wife, he was reunited with his children, and he had bought this property, bought a wood frame modest house at 18th and L Streets in Northwest Washington. Now, he worked in the pension office for many, many years. And in about 1861, there was a new co-worker named John Brooks Russell. Now, if you read A Colored Man's Reminiscences of James Madison, and the entire memoir is included as a memoir, as an appendix in my book, you will see that it starts with a preface. There's an intelligent colored man who works in the Department of the Interior. He was an eyewitness to important history, and I thought his recollections worth writing down in almost his own words. Though Paul Jennings was himself literate and learned to read and write as a slave, it was who I discovered JBR was John Brooks Russell. He was the one who did set the words down and submit A Colored Man's Reminiscences of James Madison to a history magazine in 1863, and then 2 years later it was published as a slim volume by the same name and with Jennings' byline on the title page. But there were very, very few copies ever printed. And I'm thankful that it was not altogether lost to history. It has been quoted by historians over the years, especially the passages about the War of 1812. And we're celebrating the 200th anniversary of that war today. Jennings had an exciting wartime adventure in Washington as he came of age, and he played a major role in helping Dolly Madison rescue the enormous, iconic Stuart likeness of George Washington just before the British burned the White House. This was in 1814, a hot August day. Madison had gone to the front, the only commander-in-chief to actually join troops at the front. The problem was the front was less than 10 miles away from Washington. And when those that had stayed behind in the White House, Dolly, Paul Jennings, and a couple of the other members of the domestic staff, Madison had a rider ride as hard as he could up to the White House and inform the denizens there to clear out, clear out. General Armstrong has ordered a retreat. And Jennings wrote in his memoir that all then was chaos. Dolly Madison gathered up some silver and other White House treasures. She jumped into her carriage, but before she dashed off, she turned to Jennings and the others remaining behind for the moment and said, "Save that portrait of George Washington. Do not allow the British to defile this important image of the father of our country." So Dolly Madison deserves the credit for the impulse, but Paul Jennings and two of his co-workers are actually the ones who deserve the credit for rescuing the portrait itself. Rather miraculously, it was carried off as a giant stretched canvas. You may have heard that it was cut out with a knife, rolled up. Not true. Present-day conservationists can prove that it was never cut out, never rolled up. With great effort, the frame was broken and the large picture carried away to safety to a barn in Maryland. Now, Jennings' legacy then includes the authorship of the first White House memoir and a major role in rescuing the portrait of George Washington. But there are other important elements to his legacy as well. First of all, there is the living legacy, his descendants today, and I have a feeling that Paul Jennings would be particularly proud of that legacy. These are, many of them, Washingtonians, but also they live in all four corners of the country. But almost without exception, they are people of high achievement who, like their ancestor, value family, education, activism. Paul Jennings had a granddaughter, his namesake, named Pauline. She was the daughter of a slave. She married the son of a slave, and yet he got an MD from Howard University, was a practicing physician in Georgetown, where they owned a home, which is a pretty remarkable opportunity given only one generation out of slavery, a very remarkable achievement. Their son was an MD as well, and he's one of my favorite Jennings descendants. I like to think that he inherited his ancestors' genes for race activism. As an African-American doctor, he could not go to just any medical school, could not practice in just any hospital. Black doctors were not even allowed to join the AMA. He was very active in agitating against these restrictions, but he didn't limit his activism to greater opportunities for members of his profession. He spearheaded a petition drive to keep a recreational area in Georgetown from becoming segregated, and he published bold editorials on race in the Washington Post and other newspapers. Now, that's the living legacy. I'm also fascinated by the legacy of place in Washington. It was 1809 when Paul Jennings first came to Washington to be part of the White House staff. He found Washington then a dreary place. Pennsylvania Avenue wasn't even paved. But I think soon enough, suffering from a little homesickness, he went on to realize that he was at the start of a great adventure and would be an important eyewitness to history. Well, he witnessed a lot of history in Washington. He died here in 1874 after marrying for a third time. Mrs. Alexander didn't know about that, but when I told her, she said she wasn't surprised, that her grandfather said that he was a Jim Dandy, and that characterization in her mind went along with this idea that at 71 he would marry for a third time. She told me the family story of how he learned to read and write. She said that he learned in the presence of the little master, or the white boy. Now, this might well have been Dolly's son, Payne Todd. The idea is that Payne would be the object of the instruction. Jennings would be standing off to the side, but listening, absorbing, and learning. So in the book, I present this as perhaps the first instance of Jennings taking advantage of his position. He was a good listener, and he was a good networker. Now, there are so many places that he was associated with that are extant in Washington today. One of them is not his own house. His own house, located where L Street and 18 intersect, some of you may remember, until very recently, was a Borders Books. And I would go there, and I would go into the cafe, and as I was sipping my coffee, think, I could be sitting at Paul Jennings' kitchen table right now. And as you know, unfortunately, they went out of business, so I never even had a chance to do a book talk there. Now, extant buildings where Jennings either lived and/or worked would include the Winder Building, right to the west of the White House, Washington's first high-rise, a 5-story building still used by government offices today. That's where the pension office under the Department of the Interior was first located, and then it moved to the Patent Office Building. The Patent Office Building you know today as the grand structure that houses 2 Smithsonian museums. The Dolly Madison house, where Jennings lived with his mistress until he became free in 1847, that also is there today. Paul Jennings' quarters would have been on the cellar level. After the burning of the White House, the Madison household never lived in the White House again. The temporary White House became the Octagon. And the Octagon is yet another of the buildings still in Washington. It was there that James Madison signed the Treaty of Ghent that ended the War of 1812. And Jennings writes how on that occasion, everyone in the household was thrilled to hear that news had finally arrived. Jennings said he played the President's March on the violin. The servants were instructed to pour wine liberally, including for themselves. And Jennings writes that the French steward, Jean-Pierre Soussat, was drunk for 2 days. Never, he said, was there such an exciting time in Washington. And then, of course, there is the White House. And 2 years from now will be the 200th anniversary of the rescue of the portrait of George Washington, which I would submit has allowed all Americans to identify this event as the kind of highlight of the War of 1812 instead of shrinking in sadness that the White House was ever burned by an enemy. Well, Paul Jennings does have a one-of-a-kind story. He purchased his own freedom, secured his family's future. He used his literacy to write free passes and free papers for other slaves. He contributed to the raising of funds for slaves in dire need for purchase from their masters. You know, it was in 1809 that James Madison took the oath of office as fourth president, promising to protect and defend the Constitution that he helped found. It was 200 years later that we all watched the 44th president take that same oath. It took 200 years, a shamefully long time, but we did progress from the only allowable role for a black man in the White House to be a liveried footman like Paul Jennings, to the first African-American president and his family making their home in that historic structure. President Barack Obama would be the first to acknowledge that his rapidly rising star was hitched to Paul Jennings and to untold number of other African Americans whose stories may never be known, but who, like Jennings, overcame a barrage of obstacles to rise. As has been said, there is nothing truly new in this world but the history that we have yet to learn. Thank you so much. Yes, sir.
Elizabeth, pertaining to the earlier part of your book, when you were doing your research, did you find any conversations between Madison and his predecessor, Jefferson? They were neighbors, they were, in terms of the slaves, because in Annette Gordon Reed's book, they talk about similar things that you spoke about. Did you ever find sources where they conversed and they shared their ideas?
I don't know that I found any firsthand conversations between the two of them on this subject. I can tell you that they had very similar views about it. They understood that slavery was immoral, an abominable crime, Jefferson called it. Madison said that it was a moral, economical, and social evil. Jefferson acknowledged that if it ever came down to a war between slaves and slave owners, there was no question on which side God would be. They wanted, theoretically, they wanted to see an end to slavery. It was immoral, and it was, as Madison put it, a blot on our Republican character. They wanted to see a gradual end to slavery. The sticking point became not slavery, that had to go. The sticking point became race. What do we, the white power structure, what do we do with them, the freed blacks? We certainly can't share our country with them. Now, once the concept of colonization had come to the fore, and that would involve free blacks transported to, finally, after some other possibilities, transported to West Africa, to Liberia. Well, Madison said that this concept gave him an opportunity to not be so disillusioned about the future, because he envisioned it as the green light to begin with gradual emancipation. However, he called it the double operation, and he thought that the country should not embark on emancipation until it was firmly coupled with colonization, that one should not begin the first half of this double operation until they were sure of the second half. And of course, that was not to be. Now, there was much, you know, Monticello and Montpelier are just 28 miles apart. And as Madison's manservant, every time he went to Monticello, Paul would have accompanied him. So he certainly got to know various Monticello slaves. And there were Monticello slaves that were part of Jefferson's White House that were then part of Madison's White House. One fellow in particular named John Freeman was actually purchased by President Madison from President Jefferson at the transition in their two administrations. And he was married to a member of Monticello's well-known Hemmings family. So there was plenty of interaction between the two plantations. Jennings wrote in his memoir that Jefferson and Madison were as intimate as any two brothers could be.
Let me ask you a question about, does the author, James, does he characterize the President Madison? Does he write a character sketch of him, and in Dolly, does he? He
does. Now you have to again remember that there are issues of candor in a memoir like this. As I say, this John Brooks Russell was an antiquarian, an amateur historian. And he got to learn about the backstory of his co-worker in the pension office. And I can hear him approaching Paul Jennings and saying, I understand that you used to work for President Madison. Wow, what was that like? So I think that you have to remember how that might color what Jennings talks and does not talk about. That was my frustration with the memoir. I wanted to learn more about what Jennings thought and what he was all about. Now, he does characterize James Madison as one of the best men who ever lived. He says that as a slave owner, he would never allow his overseers to whip the slaves. And indeed, part of the whole point of my book is to talk about the complex relationship between the two of them. The Madison's niece wrote of Paul Jennings that he sighed for freedom. He was enamored with freedom. Yeah, well, absolutely. He was learning at the feet of the master. And yes, he took it in and realized, as well as the next man, that learning and liberty have a direct connection with one another. And I don't think there's any doubt that Madison would have approved of Paul thinking that way. He too understood that individual rights are the gift of nature. Now, with Dolly, it got to be even more complicated because Dolly had promised, as I mentioned, in her will to free Paul Jennings. But in the end, he doubted that she would follow through on that, and he couldn't wait any longer till she might die anyway. And she didn't follow through on her husband's will, who wanted her not to free any of the slaves except for those who might misbehave. Of course, this is typical about slave owners. There's always that out. There's always that easily justified course of action that they can choose to take. So Dolly Madison, despite the fact that she sold Paul Jennings, I mean, she did set the price at $200, and she acknowledged that this was a low price because of his service. Now, what impresses me is that Jennings seems to have had a great generosity of spirit, because when he was working for Webster, he would go over to Dolly Madison's. By this time, Jennings said that she desired even the necessities of life. He would come with basketfuls of provisions, and he would give her small sums of money from his own pocket. So that really impresses me.
Yes. Frederick Douglass said that the cruelest master is the master who brings you very close, is the good master, if you will, someone who you're eating from his table, you're wearing his hand-me-down clothes, you have a lot of liberty and all that, but that's the cruelest master because he brings you so close, but it's at the same point you don't have your liberty. Jennings eventually wanted his freedom, but also Hercules, who was George Washington's slave, who was like that. He ran away. How deep was Paul Jennings' motivation to gain his freedom?
Well, first of all, let me say, as someone who was responsible for interpretation at Monticello and then Montpelier, visitors will come there and want the interpreter to assure them that Jefferson, Madison, they were good masters, right? And I will not answer such a question directly, and instead what I do is quote Frederick Douglass saying, "The feeding and clothing of me well cannot atone for taking my liberty away." It wasn't so much the living conditions of slaves in the Upper South at this time that was the most profound and galling part of being enslaved, but rather, as you say, it was the lack of freedom of person. It was the inability to transfer the fruit of your own labors onto your children. And sometimes we hear about a hierarchy within the slave community with the idea that, oh, the house slaves were certainly better off than those who had to work in the field. But I think that's a debatable subject because they were also under the master's eye for 24 hours a day. If you were a field slave, you might put in a grueling 14-hour day, but when you went back to your cabin after work, the night was your own. But a house servant like Paul Jennings could be called upon any time to service those in the big house. And of course, for Jennings, the most galling part of it was when he had to go back to Washington with Dolly, leaving his wife and children behind. And then, as I say, after his wife died, these are now motherless children. So I think that was his final motivating factor to say, now, not later. Yes, sir.
One thing I noticed about your book is that it seems to tie historical arcs that don't appear to be related. For example, the rescue of the great painting of George Washington. It has occurred to me for a long time that by saving that, in addition to the fact you saved a great work, if they hadn't done that, it would have retarded what later became the arc of U.S.-British reconciliation. I know that's not the purpose of your book, but has that occurred to you? Because it has occurred to me for some time.
You mean because they would have indeed enjoyed defiling the image of the father of our country?
Maybe, but mostly because it becomes a grievance. You see individual grievances interfering with reconciliation between countries.
I mean, that's why, despite the fact that it was really Jennings and some of his co-workers who followed through on the actual rescue, that's why I would never say it's not fair to give Dolly Madison most of the credit, because it was her patriotic impulse to make sure that that didn't happen that led to the rescue of the portrait. And if you go to see one of these Lansdowne's portraits of George Washington painted by Gilbert Stuart, there is, of course, the one in the East Room that is there today because of the action of Jennings and others, but also another one that's in the National Portrait Gallery. It's 95 inches high, and you don't know until you look at it what a effort of work it had to be to remove it from the wall.
Thank you. It's really nice to find out a little bit about the background of an event that could have had historical significance.
Yeah, very true. All right, well, thank you very, very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.